September 1945. A cold draft crawls through the wooden barracks of a temporary American-run POW compound. Inside, 26 Japanese nurses freeze at the sound of footsteps in the hallway. A door slams somewhere down the corridor. Boots echo. Metal keys rattle. And without a word, the women dive under their bunks like frightened children. Hands shaking, breathing shallow. Eyes wide and glassy in the dim light. For months, they had been warned that this moment would come. American soldiers would drag them out, violate them, break them, strip every last piece of dignity from their bodies. Their officers swore it. Their commanders repeated it. Some even said death was better than falling into enemy hands. So the women hide knees pressed to their chests, photographs of family clutched tight, waiting for the nightmare they were promised. The footsteps stop outside their door. A shadow moves beneath the crack. The key turns. One nurse muffles a sob. Then, a soft knock. "Ma'am?" "Just checking the locks." The women freeze. No shouting, no violence, no hands grabbing them. Just a guard's voice, calm, controlled, almost gentle. They expected monsters. Instead, they found something far more terrifying. Kindness. The fear did not begin in the American compound. It began years earlier, long before surrender, long before transport ships and cramped bunks and cold wooden floors. It began in classrooms, in training halls, in whispered warnings passed between nurses barely older than schoolgirls. "Americans do not take prisoners," the instructor said. "Americans do not see you as women. If they catch you, your honor is gone. Death is kinder." Those words were not shouted. They were spoken in low, steady tones, the kind people use when they believe every syllable. So the young women memorized them. They held those warnings tighter than they held their textbooks, tighter than they held their medical kits. Many had never seen an American in their lives, but they saw posters, leaflets, drawings, images twisted into demons with square jaws and hungry hands, stories of barbarian soldiers who would rather break a woman than capture her. Fear was not taught. It was carved. And in that carving, a monster was born shaped from lies, rumors, and the trembling voices of superiors who themselves were afraid. For years, these nurses believed that monster waited across the ocean. Then war came, and that monster stopped being a story. It became a promise. The final days before capture. The last weeks of the Japanese Empire were a blur of smoke, ash, and desperation. Cities burned, supply lines collapsed, hospitals overflowed, and across the islands of the Pacific, the nurses did what they could with what little they had. Some treated soldiers whose wounds were so terrible they could not be looked at without swallowing tears. Others carried children through bombed villages, their tiny chests rising and falling in uneven gasps. Every day felt like the last day. Then the surrender came. Not like a grand announcement, not with clarity or ceremony. It came as chaos. An officer burst into a Manila field clinic and shouted orders so fast the women could hardly understand him. "Burn the records. Pack your bags. Prepare to be transferred." Transferred where? No one said. One nurse, Aiko, 19 years old, asked quietly, "Sir, to Japan?" The officer's jaw tightened. "To American custody." A wave of shock tore through the room. Some women gasped. Others simply froze. One covered her mouth with both hands, as if holding back a scream. Another whispered, "We will never survive." But the order stood. They packed. They burned documents that smelled of ink and fear. They folded uniforms that still carried the sweat of 3 years of service. and beneath their calm exterior, their stomachs churned like storms. Before leaving, an older officer addressed them one last time, trying to sound strong even as his hands shook. "Remember your dignity," he said. "Americans will do unspeakable things. If you must die, die with honor." The silence that followed wrapped itself around every girl in that room. Some believed him, some didn't. But all of them felt the same cold truth. This was not a transfer. This was a sentence. The journey to the unknown. The transport began with trucks dark, rattling, with wooden panels that splintered against their palms as they climbed in. No men escorted them, only a few exhausted guards who looked at the nurses with hollow eyes. Even the guards didn't speak much. What could they say? The empire had fallen. Everyone was afraid. At night, the nurses were kept inside an abandoned school building converted into a temporary holding area. The chalkboards still hung on the walls. Children's drawings were scratched beneath layers of dust. It felt like a ghost of a different world. Some women tried to sleep sitting up. Others stayed awake, whispering old childhood songs just to feel human. One nurse, Keiko, age 20, cried quietly as she held the edge of her sleeve to her lips. "I don't want them to touch me," she whispered into the dark. Her friend Yuna squeezed her hand. "We will stay together, no matter what happens." The building smelled of mold, damp wood, and fear. On the second night, when distant artillery echoed across the hills, several nurses instinctively ducked to the floor. The sound of war had trained their bodies to react before their minds even thought. The guards came by to check on them, but even their presence brought no comfort. Everyone knew what waited next. The ship, the Americans, the monster, crossing the Pacific. When the nurses finally boarded the vessel, a converted transport ship, most of them couldn't even feel their legs. Their bodies trembled from exhaustion, shock, and silent dread. American sailors escorted them to their quarters, but the interaction was so strange it left the women more terrified than before. The sailors knocked before they opened a door. Knocked, waited, then stepped aside as the nurses passed. They didn't speak. They didn't stare. They didn't even stand too close. It was so unlike the warnings they had heard that it almost felt like a trick, a trap, a calm before a violence they had been promised their whole lives. The quarters were cramped metal bunks stacked 3 high, the smell of rust mixed with seawater, engine vibrations humming through the floors, but they were clean. Meals came 3 times a day. Rice, vegetables, canned soup, better than what they had eaten in months. But the silence of the American crew was the loudest part of the journey. No laughs, no casual chatter, no insults. Only those steady knocks, only that careful distance. On the 4th day, one of the women, Hana, 22, clutched her blanket and whispered, "Why won't they even look at us?" Miko, the eldest nurse, answered with a steady voice that didn't match the fear in her own eyes. "Because they are planning something. Monsters always wait until you are calm." The younger women nodded. Fear will believe anything. Arrival at the American compound. The transport ship arrived at night. The sky was a sheet of dark velvet, the moon veiled by drifting clouds. Cold wind crashed against the deck, cutting through the nurses' thin uniforms like invisible knives. As they stepped onto the dock, they immediately froze. American soldiers stood in neat rows, tall, calm, alert. Weapons slung casually over their shoulders. No shouting. No grabbing. No leering eyes. Their formation looked almost respectful. But the nurses didn't see discipline. Their minds translated everything into danger. "They will separate us," whispered Yuki, clutching her sleeves. "They will take us one by one." "No," Miko said firmly, gripping her arm. "We walk together. We breathe together. No one breaks." Still, their legs shook. Some had not slept properly in weeks. Some had not eaten more than half rations in days. Some were so numb that even the cold felt far away. An American officer stepped forward, clipboard in hand. His uniform was crisp, his posture steady, his expression unreadable. He spoke through an interpreter, inviting the women to follow quietly to assigned quarters. When he bowed his head slightly, just an inch, a gesture of basic courtesy, the nurses nearly recoiled in confusion. Why would the enemy bow? What game was this? But there was no time to think. They were led toward the compound, toward the barracks that would become their new world. The barracks were simple wooden structures, warmer than the ship, but still cold, with shadows pooling in the corners like black water. The women were given blankets, thin, worn, but clean. They were given cups of warm tea. One nurse cried softly, holding it, the steam rising between trembling fingers. But their fear did not ease. Fear built its own home inside the human body. It stayed even when the danger didn't. The nurses arranged their bunks, folded their clothes, and unpacked the few belongings they had left. Then night fell, and with night came the footsteps, heavy, measured, echoing down the hallway. Every step tightened the room, tightened their chests, tightened their sense of impending doom. A door shut somewhere nearby. Another set of boots crossed the corridor. Keys jingled, sharp, metallic, unmistakable. In an instant, without warning, without thinking, nearly every woman dove under her bunk. Bodies pressed to the cold floor. Breaths held. Throats dry. Their terror was total, instinctive, absolute. Some whispered prayer fragments. Some clutched rosaries or photographs. Some simply closed their eyes and waited for the door to burst open. The footsteps grew louder, closer, stopping just outside their room. A shadow settled under the crack of the door. A key slid into the lock. One nurse, Aya, bit her tongue to keep from screaming. This was it. This was the moment they had been warned of for years. The moment they would lose everything. And then, a knock. A soft, steady, unbelievably polite knock. "Ma'am, just checking the locks." The women froze. Every narrative they believed shattered in a single second of quiet respect. They didn't climb out from under the bunks for a long time, not because they were still afraid the guard would return, but because their bodies could not process what had just happened. The great monster they feared had knocked. Knocked, as if they were human, as if they deserved dignity, as if he didn't want to frighten them. For some of the women, this moment was even more terrifying than anything they expected, because it made them ask themselves a question they had never dared ask. What if everything they were taught was a lie? The emotional weight of silence. When the footsteps faded, the nurses slowly crawled out from under their bunks. Some stood, some sank to the floor. Some stared blankly at the door, waiting for something, anything to make sense. Hana whispered, Why did he knock?" Keiko answered, voice barely audible, "I don't know." Miko rubbed her trembling hands together, trying to calm the younger girls. She flattened her uniform, took a deep breath, and said, "Do not be fooled. Americans are clever. Kindness can be a trap." But even she didn't believe her own words completely. Something felt wrong. Not wrong like danger, wrong like truth. And truth was the one thing they were not prepared for. Outside, boots continued to echo down the hallway. Doors opened. Doors closed. Locks clicked shut. But every sound felt different now. Different because they knew the footsteps could reach their door and walk away again, without force, without shouting, without taking anything from them. The room was quiet for a long time, a stillness so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. Finally, Aiko broke the silence. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Are we prisoners? Or are we being protected?" No one had an answer. Not yet. But the question would stay with them for days, haunting every step, every noise, every unexpected act of American restraint. And this question would slowly tear apart the fear they had carried for years. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, the same way the guard had knocked on their door. The night after the first knock, almost none of the women slept. They lay awake in their bunks long after the corridor lights dimmed, eyes open, staring into the wooden ceiling as if searching for answers carved somewhere in the grain. Some replayed the knock in their minds, soft, polite, unreal. Others listened obsessively for footsteps, waiting to see if the strangeness would repeat. A few whispered quietly to each other beneath their blankets. Maybe they only behaved during the first night. Maybe they were being watched. Maybe they were testing our reaction. Fear tries to rewrite kindness until it fits the shape of what you already believe. But dawn came, and so did more footsteps. And again, knocking. Always knocking. Always waiting for acknowledgement. Always leaving space 2 full steps between themselves and the doorway. No shouting, no rush, no hands reaching. Just patient, controlled movement. The women didn't know what to do with this. It was easier to prepare for violence than to prepare for restraint. Violence had rules. Violence made sense. Violence matched what they were told. But respect? Respect from the enemy? This was the kind of thing that cracked a person open from the inside. The routine of a fear. They no longer understood. The second day began with roll call. The nurses lined up in 2 rows inside the barrack hallway. Their uniforms, worn, creased, and thin, hung loosely on their small frames. Most looked down at the floor, as they had been trained to do when in front of foreign soldiers. An American sergeant stood outside with a clipboard. He didn't bark orders. He didn't pace aggressively. He didn't glare at them with predatory eyes. He simply called out names slowly, clearly, almost gently. When he reached a name he couldn't pronounce, he paused. "I'm sorry if I say this wrong," he muttered, adjusting the paper. The interpreter beside him repeated each name in Japanese, but the nurses heard the sincerity in the sergeant's tone. No mockery, no impatience, just a foreign man trying to get their names right. Several women exchanged glances. They didn't smile. Fear still lived in their bones, but something shifted. Something small. Something quiet. Something they pretended not to feel. When roll call ended, another American soldier approached, carrying a crate of supplies. The nurses stiffened immediately, hands tightening on their sleeves, shoulders rising like shields. But he didn't enter. He set the crate on the ground, stepped back, and waited. Only when a female interpreter gestured for the women to collect the items did he turn away and walk down the hall. The crate contained soap, bandages, basic medicines, blankets, small tins of ointment, items the women hadn't seen in months. Some nurses took them with trembling hands. Others left theirs untouched, too unsure to accept anything from the enemy. One girl, Emmy, held a bar of soap to her nose and inhaled. It smelled faintly of mint. She blinked away sudden tears, whispering, "I forgot what clean things smelled like." Small moments that cut deeper than fear. Over the next few days, routine settled into something the nurses didn't know how to name. Not safety, not comfort, something stranger than both. A soft foreignness that wrapped itself around them like morning fog. Every afternoon, an American medic came to check on them, always accompanied by a female interpreter. He wore thick glasses, had hair that stuck out awkwardly from under his cap, and looked more like a teacher than a soldier. He kept his voice low, his movements slow, his hands carefully tucked behind his back, unless he absolutely needed to gesture. On the third visit, he paused beside a nurse named Sayo, whose bandaged ankle had begun to swell. He crouched not close, not touching, but at a respectful distance, and pointed gently at her foot. "Pain?" he asked, using the interpreter's help. Sayo swallowed hard and nodded once. The medic reached into his bag and lifted a small bottle of disinfectant. He didn't move forward. He extended his arm halfway, then stopped, waiting for permission. Sayo froze. The nurses behind her held their breath, uncertain whether accepting help was a betrayal or refusing it was foolish. Finally, Sayo extended her foot a little. Not bravely, not confidently, but enough. The medic cleaned the wound with slow, careful motions. He didn't speak unless necessary. He didn't touch her, except where absolutely required. When he finished, he bowed his head slightly, an event so unexpected that some nurses gasped softly. Then he stepped back, packed his kit, and left. Sayo stared at her bandaged ankle for a long time. "That didn't feel like the enemy," she whispered. Emmy, sitting beside her, replied quietly, "That's why it's dangerous." The prison of expectations. The hardest part was not the cold, not the unfamiliar food, not the soldiers who passed by without raising their voices. The hardest part was the confusion. Confusion carved deeper wounds than cruelty. The nurses had built their fear carefully, brick by brick, for years. Fear was a fortress. Fear was protection. But every polite gesture, every unnecessary kindness, every moment of quiet respect chipped at that fortress, cracked it, made it crumble in places they didn't want to look at. During mealtime, the American guards placed trays on a table outside the barracks and stepped back. The nurses waited eyes wide, hands pressed together, expecting to be pushed or commanded. But the guards only nodded for them to come forward. No rush, no competition, no threat. The food was plain: rice, boiled vegetables, occasionally slices of bread that tasted strange and soft. Some nurses forced themselves to eat quickly, as they had during bomb raids. Others ate slowly, tasting each bite as though they weren't sure it was real. Yuna whispered to her friend, "These portions, they're bigger than ours." Hikari murmured back, "They want us to drop our guard. That's how traps work." But her voice lacked conviction, because no trap lasted this long without springing. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the compound fences, a commotion erupted near the gate. An American truck arrived unexpectedly. The engine sputtered loudly. Metal rattled. Voices rose. The nurses froze in the middle of folding blankets. The sound of heavy boots, shouting men, clanking gear, it triggered every memory of chaos they had survived. Their bodies reacted before thought. Several women fell to their knees. Others pressed against the wall. One girl screamed softly into her hands. The door burst open. A guard stepped inside, out of breath. The nurses cowered instantly, but the guard raised his palms in a slow, peaceful gesture. "Stay calm," the interpreter translated quickly. "Please do not be afraid. No one is coming for you." The guard explained that a group of American soldiers recently returned from frontline service had arrived intoxicated, demanding entry to the women's barracks, just to look inside. The nurses trembled violently, expecting the worst. But what happened next stunned them more deeply than any kindness so far. The American officer in charge had stepped in immediately, ordering the drunken men away from the area. He threatened disciplinary action. He warned that prisoners under American protection were not to be approached, disturbed, or harassed under any circumstance. Then he stationed extra guards outside the women's quarters for the night. Guards facing outward, not inward. Guards protecting them. Protecting prisoners. Protecting Japanese women. Protecting the very people they had been told Americans would destroy without mercy. The nurses sat in silence long after the footsteps and shouting faded. Finally, Miko spoke. Her voice was fragile, not broken, just tired. "They didn't come to hurt us," she whispered. "They came to keep others away." I shook her head slowly, eyes glossy with confusion. "But why?" No one could answer, because the answer forced them to confront a truth too painful to hold. Girls who were told they were women. In the days that followed, small pieces of their old selves began to show tentatively, quietly, like fragile shoots pushing through frozen soil. The youngest nurses, those barely 19, began whispering about home again. They spoke of siblings they missed, neighborhoods reduced to rubble, festivals they had attended before the world turned dark. Some still had the small hairpins their mothers gave them when they left for service. They touched them often, as if reminding themselves they were daughters long before they were nurses. The older women, those in their mid-20s, carried their grief differently. They had seen more, lost more, buried more. They watched the Americans with guarded curiosity. Not trust, never trust, but the sharp edge of terror had dulled. One afternoon, a nurse named Rena sat by the window, watching two American guards stand post outside. "They look bored," she murmured. Hannah followed her gaze. "They don't look like demons." Rena nodded. "They look like boys." And that was the strangest realization of all. The nurses had been told Americans were monsters, but these men with their loose uniforms, tired eyes, and clumsy attempts at politeness looked more like villagers, farmers, students, brothers. Not demons, just boys who had also been at war. The nurses did not say this out loud. Some truths were too dangerous to admit even inside their own minds. The diary that changed everything. Among the group was a quiet girl named Naomi, who kept a small notebook hidden beneath her mattress. It wasn't a diary in the traditional sense. She didn't write about dreams or love or daily life. She wrote fears, cold, blunt, unfiltered fears. The notebook held lines like, "Americans will hurt us the first chance they get. I cannot sleep because footsteps sound like danger. If I am taken, I hope it is quick." And then, somewhere around the middle of Section 2, the words changed. New pages read, "Today, they waited for us to finish eating before they locked the room. The guard apologized for waking us. A medic treated Emmy's wound very gently. Why is this happening? What do they want?" And finally, a line she wrote after the guards protected them from the drunken soldiers. "They guarded our door tonight, not as captors, but as shields." When Naomi showed these entries to Miko and Yuna, the two older nurses sat quietly beside her. They didn't speak for a long time. Finally, Yuna whispered, "We cannot tell the others." "Why?" Naomi asked softly. Miko answered, "Because if they believe this, and it turns out to be false, their hope will kill them faster than any soldier." Naomi closed the notebook gently. But her hands were trembling not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of hoping for something she had never allowed herself to imagine: humanity from the enemy. The night they stopped running from footsteps. It happened on the 7th night. The barracks creaked softly in the wind. The moonlight spilled through the slats in the shutters, painting silver lines across the wooden floor. The nurses lay in their bunks, wrapped in thin blankets, whispering quietly to pass time. Then came the familiar sound. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, steady. But this time, the women didn't move. They tensed, yes. Their breaths hitched, yes. But they didn't dive. They didn't scramble under the bunks. They didn't hide like frightened shadows. They stayed on their beds. They listened. The footsteps stopped outside their door. A key turned in the lock. Their hearts pounded. Then, a knock. "Ma'am?" "Just checking the locks." The same voice, the same tone, the same respect. Sayo exhaled. Aiko covered her mouth with one hand. Miko blinked slowly, realizing her hands weren't shaking as much anymore. The footsteps moved on. Someone whispered, "He said ma'am," again. Silence followed. A soft, trembling silence. Not of fear, of release. Of the smallest seed of trust taking root in soil devastated by war. That night, for the first time since surrender, some of the women slept without waking in panic. Not because they felt safe, but because they no longer felt hunted. And sometimes that is the gentlest beginning of healing. The change did not come all at once. It arrived quietly, like a draft slipping under a door. A shift so small the women almost didn't notice at first. Aiko stopped flinching every time the lock clicked. Hana no longer pressed her fingers into her palms hard enough to leave marks. Even Miko, the eldest, the one who told them to expect tricks and traps, no longer watched the door with clenched fists. But fear, even when fading, never leaves cleanly. It clings, it waits, it resurfaces, and it returned on a night colder than any they had faced so far. The collapse. It was close to midnight when the crisis began. A nurse named Rena, soft-spoken, small, barely 20, had been coughing for days. She insisted she was fine. Everyone said exhaustion was making her weak, but none of them truly saw how pale she had become, how her breathing thinned, how she pressed a hand to her ribs after every cough as if trying to hold herself together. That night, her fever finally broke through whatever strength she had left. One moment she was sitting upright on her bunk, blanket draped around her shoulders. The next, she pitched forward and hit the wooden floor with a dull, terrifying thud. Hana screamed. Aiko scrambled down from her bunk. Miko rushed over, lifting Rena's shoulders. Her skin burned like fire. Her eyes fluttered, unfocused. Her breath rattled shallowly, like someone trying to drink air through a cracked straw. "She's burning up," Miko whispered, fear slicing through her voice. But fear wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the decision they now had to make, to call for help or to stay silent. Because calling for help meant Americans entering the room. Entering. Something they still could not fully accept. Something their bodies still recoiled from, even when their minds insisted the danger had passed. Hana looked toward the door, trembling. "If we shout, will they come inside?" Aiko's voice cracked. "If we do nothing, she might die." The room filled with the sound of Rena's labored breathing, harsh, uneven, frightening. Fear told them, "Keep quiet." Humanity told them, "Call for help." Miko closed her eyes, inhaled sharply, and made the decision. She shouted, "Help! Help! Please!" Her voice tore through the hallway like a blade. The women braced themselves. Boots thundered, keys rattled. Voices rose outside the door. And then a knock. A knock, Even in urgency, they knocked. "Ma'am, we're entering to help," the guard said through the door. Not a single soldier pushed inside without warning. Not a single one shouted at them to step aside. They waited for acknowledgement, waited for permission, waited for women who were technically prisoners, people they had defeated to grant them entry. Miko swallowed. "Come in," she whispered. The door opened, and the monster stepped inside. Except it wasn't a monster. It was the medic with the thick glasses and the quiet voice. Behind him, two guards kept their distance, hands clasped behind their backs, eyes fixed respectfully on the far wall instead of the women. The medic knelt beside Rena. He didn't touch her immediately. He scanned her face, her breathing, the trembling in her limbs. Then he turned his head slightly. "May I?" he asked, voice low. Miko nodded. Only then did he place his hand gently on Rena's forehead. "She's dehydrated. Fever's very high," he murmured. "Possible infection." He opened his bag, pulled out supplies, and began working with quick, precise movements. The nurses watched silent, stunned. The medic cleaned her mouth, placed a cool cloth on her forehead, checked her pulse, administered a small dose of medicine. His hands never trembled, his tone never hardened. His eyes never scanned the room with the hunger they had feared all their lives. He was calm, professional, human. The guards stayed still by the door, like statues, backs turned, giving the women privacy, while also keeping the medic safe. Aiko clutched her hands to her chest. "He's helping her," she whispered, voice cracking. "Of course," Miko breathed, her voice barely audible. But inside her, something broke. Years of warnings, years of terror, years of believing kindness from the enemy was impossible. And here was kindness, kneeling on the wooden floor of an American compound, tending to a frightened, feverish Japanese girl with the gentleness of a brother. The question they could no longer avoid. When Rena stabilized, the medic stood slowly, wiping sweat from his brow. He glanced toward Miko. "She should be watched tonight. Let us know if her breathing worsens." He packed his kit, bowed his head slightly, a habit the women still didn't understand, and stepped back. Before leaving, Miko found the courage to speak. Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. Her Japanese words trembled, but the interpreter translated faithfully. The medic blinked behind his glasses. Then he answered in English, simple, steady, unhesitating. "Because you're under our care." The interpreter repeated it. "Our care?" Miko felt the words hit her chest, like a weight. She swallowed hard, eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. "Yes," the medic replied. "You're prisoners, but you're still people, and people deserve care." Those words were a foreign language even when translated, not because they couldn't understand them, because they had never heard anything like them, from anyone, not from commanders, not from superior officers, not from propaganda, not even from their own side. As the medic stepped out of the room, Aiko whispered, "Does he mean it?" Miko didn't know, but she felt something shifting inside her, something like the slow cracking of stone. The emotional fallout. After the Americans left, the nurses sat in a tight circle around Rena's bunk. The room was warm, but each woman trembled as though caught in a winter storm. Not from fear, from something deeper. From the fragile beginning of trust they didn't want, didn't understand, and didn't know how to carry. Naomi opened her notebook. She flipped to a blank page. Her pencil hovered. She wrote one line. "Tonight, the enemy saved Rena." Hana leaned over her shoulder. Her lips parted. That doesn't feel real. Naomi didn't answer. She wrote another line. Why does kindness feel like a harder thing to accept than cruelty? That question hung in the air like smoke. Aiko wiped her cheeks discreetly. I thought they would wait until we were asleep, to take us one by one, she whispered. But they knocked. Even now. Even in emergency. They always knock, Miko murmured. Yuna shook her head. I don't understand them. None of them did. But for the first time, they wanted to. The next morning, Rena woke weak but conscious. The relief in the room was immediate and painful. The women gathered around her, touching her arms, smoothing her hair, whispering blessings. When they told her the Americans had helped, her eyes widened with fear. They came inside? She asked, trembling. Yes, Miko said softly, but they asked permission first. Rena blinked. Once, twice. Then tears filled her eyes, not from fear, but from something heavier. Shame. They helped me, she whispered. And I always thought. Her words crumbled into sobs. Hikari reached for her hand. It's not your fault, she whispered. But Rena shook her head. It feels like a betrayal to feel grateful. The room fell silent. Every woman knew that feeling. The guilt of relief. The shame of feeling human around the enemy. The confusion of wanting to believe in goodness after years of being told goodness didn't exist on the other side. Miko finally spoke, voice low and steady. War lied to us. She swallowed hard. And it's harder to face the truth than the lie. A kindness that hurt more than cruelty. Later that afternoon, an American guard approached with 2 extra blankets for Rena. He placed them carefully at the doorway, bowed his head slightly, and walked away without a word. The women stared at the blankets as if they were contraband. Something forbidden. Something dangerous. Naomi whispered, Why do they keep doing this? Hana answered, Because it makes everything harder. And she was right. Cruelty would have been easier. Cruelty would have matched the stories. Cruelty would have justified fear. But kindness? Kindness forced them to question everything their officers, their government, the war itself, and the walls inside their own minds. Kindness demanded courage, sometimes more courage than facing monsters. The moment that broke the last wall. On the 10th night, the nurses sat quietly in their bunks, watching Rena breathe steadily in her sleep. The compound hummed with distant engines. The wind whispered through the cracks in the walls. Somewhere far off, a guard coughed a soft human sound, and then they heard it again. The familiar rhythm of footsteps, slow, measured, comfortably predictable. The women looked toward the door. No one moved. No one panicked. No one ran under the bunks. The footsteps stopped outside. The key turned. The shadow fell beneath the door. And then a knock. Ma'am? Just checking the locks. Something shifted. Something subtle. Something profound. Aiko nodded to herself. Hana exhaled. Miko closed her eyes. This time, the knock did not sound like danger. It sounded like routine, like structure, like strange, unfamiliar safety. It sounded like the truth beginning to override the lies. What they could finally admit to themselves. Later that night, as the women whispered in the dark, Naomi wrote in her notebook again. This time her handwriting was steadier. I no longer feel hunted. She paused, then added, That scares me more than anything. Miko, lying in the bunk beside her, whispered, It scares us all. Because acceptance was harder than fear. Because the enemy had become human. Because the greatest battle left was not survival. It was unlearning. Morning came slowly that final week, with a pale orange glow stretching across the compound like a hesitant promise. Inside the women's barracks, the nurses stirred awake, their movements soft and unhurried. Rena breathed steadily in her sleep, her fever finally broken. The others rose quietly, adjusting their blankets, smoothing their uniforms, carrying themselves with a strange new calm. Not peace. Never peace. War doesn't allow peace that easily, but something gentler. Something like the first breath after years of suffocation. For the first time since their capture, the fear in the room felt smaller. Not gone. Not forgotten. Just no longer the monstrous thing that ruled their every heartbeat. When the guards passed by for morning checks, they knocked again just as they always had. And for the first time, one of the nurses, Aiko, answered without trembling. "Yes," she called softly. "We are awake." The guard nodded, his posture professional, his expression neutral. He moved on. Aiko watched his silhouette fade down the hallway, and she felt something she could barely name. Not trust, not warmth, something quieter. Recognition, maybe. The realization that both sides were made of human beings who were just trying to follow orders, trying to survive, trying to hold on to pieces of dignity in a world that had torn so much away. What they never spoke out loud. Later that afternoon, as sunlight spilled across the compound fences, Naomi closed her notebook for the final time. She had filled every page. Fear, confusion, shame, brief sparks of gratitude she didn't know how to admit. Moments carved in trembling handwriting, each word heavier than the next. She pressed the notebook to her chest and whispered, "I want to remember the truth. Not the stories. The truth that Americans knocked, that they bowed their heads slightly before speaking, that they stepped back from doorways, that they guarded the women from their own drunken soldiers, that a medic saved Rena without hesitation, without judgment, without cruelty. These were not stories anyone had taught them. These were truths they had seen. Truths that hurt more than the lies. Because once the lie of monsters shatters, you begin to see the world differently. You begin to see yourself differently. When the war became history instead of fear. A week later, the nurses were moved again, this time to a larger facility where they would remain until repatriation. But on their final night in the temporary compound, the women gathered near the door, blankets wrapped around their shoulders, sitting close enough for their knees to touch. They didn't speak much. Some watched Rena sleep. Some stared at the wooden walls they had once feared would be broken through. Some simply breathed, letting the silence of the room settle around them like a fragile memory. When footsteps finally approached, slow, steady, familiar, they listened without panic. The key turned. A knock. "Ma'am?" Last check of the night. Not a threat, not a warning, a gesture, a ritual they had come to understand. Miko looked toward the door and whispered to the younger girls, "You don't have to hide." No one moved. No one crawled under bunks. No one covered their faces in fear. They stayed where they were. Still tense, fear never fades completely, but present. Present enough to face the truth quietly, bravely, painfully. The truth that the enemy they feared most never came. What they carried home. They would return to Japan months later, thin, exhausted, changed in ways their families would never fully understand. Some never spoke of their time in American custody. Some hinted at it in letters or diary entries. Some carried the memories silently, letting them settle into the corners of their lives like dust that never brushes away. But every woman who lived through those nights carried one lesson with them, a truth that outlasted the propaganda, the war, the ruin. There are monsters in every army. There is cruelty on every side. But sometimes, in the unlikeliest place, from the unlikeliest people, on the coldest of nights, you find something you never expected. Respect, dignity, humanity. A knock on a door instead of a fist. A medic's steady hands instead of violence. A guard standing outside to protect you instead of harm you. These moments do not erase the horrors of war. They do not rewrite history. But they reveal a truth every generation needs to hear. The world does not break because of cruelty. The world breaks when we believe cruelty is all that exists. And somewhere in a forgotten compound in 1945, a group of frightened young women learned that the enemy they feared most was human too.